This is History is a Story, and today we turn to a conflict often described as the Forgotten War. In the summer of 1950, on a divided peninsula in East Asia, war erupted with sudden and devastating force. What began as a regional conflict was rapidly drawing the world's greatest powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and China, transforming Korea into one of the most dangerous battlegrounds of the Cold War. But the roots of this war stretch back further. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Korea, once unified, was split in two along the 38th parallel. In the north, a Soviet-backed communist state emerged. In the south, a separate government was formed under American influence. Each side claimed legitimacy over the entire peninsula. As tensions deepened, that fragile division became increasingly unstable. When North Korean forces crossed the border in June 1950, the response was immediate, and the consequences immense. What followed was a brutal 3-year struggle marked by rapid advances, desperate retreats, massive international intervention, and extraordinary human cost. From the frozen hills of the north to the shattered cities of the south, soldiers and civilians alike were swept into a war that would not end in victory, but in stalemate, and a divided Korea that still exists today. In this episode, we explore how that division began, and how the conflict escalated, and why the Korean War continues to shape global politics more than 70 years later. This is a story of a war that never truly ended. To understand the Korean War, we must first return to the closing years of the Second World War, conflict that redrew the map of the modern world. Let's begin. By 1945, Europe and Asia had been consumed by 6 years of total war. Cities lay in ruins, empires had collapsed, and two new superpowers had emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Though allies in defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, their relationship was already fracturing beneath the surface. The final stages of the war in the Pacific, Japan still occupied the Korean Peninsula, a harsh colonial rule that had lasted for decades. But as Japan's defeat became inevitable, Allied planners faced an urgent question: what would happen to Korea once the war ended? In August 1945, in the closing days of the conflict, Soviet forces entered northern Korea while American forces moved into the south. With little time for detailed negotiation, the peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, a line intended as temporary administrative boundary, not as a permanent border. Japan's surrender soon followed, and Korea was freed from occupation for the first time in 35 years. But liberation did not bring unity. Instead, it brought division. Two separate governments began to form, each backed by a rival superpower, each claiming to represent all of Korea. The Soviet Union supported a communist administration in the north, while the United States backed an anti-communist government in the south. What had begun as a temporary wartime arrangement slowly hardened into something far more permanent, a front line in the emerging Cold War. And it was from this fractured foundation that just 5 years later, the Korean War would erupt. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th, 1950, and it marked 76 years ago, yesterday, it was not gradual escalation, it was a lightning strike. Within hours, artillery thundered across the border, armoured columns pushed through the south through the morning mist, and the South Korean army, underprepared and outmatched, began to collapse almost immediately. Seoul, the capital, would fall in just 3 days. For the outside world, the speed of the invasion was shocking. The Cold War had been tense, yes, but until this moment it had largely been fought through politics, espionage, and proxy pressure. Korea changed that. Suddenly, it was real war again. And the response came just as quickly. Within days, the United Nations Security Council convened in an emergency session, in a rare moment of unity and crucially in the absence of a Soviet veto. The UN called for the member states to defend South Korea. It was the first major collective military action under the United Nations banner. The United States took immediate command of the response, committing ground forces, air power, and naval support. Under General Douglas MacArthur, troops were rushed from Japan into the collapsing Southern Front. By that point, South Korean and American forces were already being pushed back into the shrinking defensive perimeter in the far southeast, a desperate stand around the port city of Busan. There, along the so-called Busan perimeter, the war stabilized for the first time. For weeks, the line held by only the narrowest margin. Exhausted soldiers dug into the hills, supplies ran dangerously low, and behind the front lines, refugees poured south in their thousands, turning roads into rivers of displacement and fear. It was not yet a counterattack. It was survival. And in those early months of the war, it was far from clear whether South Korea or the UN forces defending it would survive at all. But what came next would change the entire shape of the conflict. Because in September 1950, the war would take an unexpected turn, one that would push it far beyond Korea's borders and bring new powers crashing into the fight. By this stage in the war, the imbalance between the two Koreas had become impossible to ignore. South Korea, though under immense pressure, was no longer fighting alone. What began as a national defence had transformed into a vast international coalition. Under the United Nations banner, forces arrived from all across the world. The United States providing the bulk of the manpower and firepower, but alongside troops from the UK, Canada, Australia, Turkey, France, Greece, the Netherlands, Belgium, New Zealand, Ethiopia, Colombia, Thailand, the Philippines, and several other nations. It was one of the first truly multinational military coalitions in modern history. Soldiers from vast different languages, cultures, and continents now found themselves fighting side by side in the hills and valleys of Korea. North Korea, by contrast, began the war with a far narrower base of support. Its forces were primarily drawn from its own military, heavily influenced. Sorry, I've completely lost my place. Let me just find myself quickly. Where am I? Its forces were primarily drawn from its own military, heavily influenced and supplied by the Soviet Union in terms of training, equipment, and early strategic planning. But unlike the South, there was no broad international coalition fighting directly on its behalf at the opening stage of the conflict. I've lost my place again, so sorry. Do you mind if I just restart the paragraph? This created a striking asymmetry on the battlefield. On one side, a growing international force coordinated through the United States and its allies. On the other, a tightly focused North Korean army that had achieved surprise in early momentum, but now found itself stretched thin across an increasingly unstable front. And yet, despite the imbalance, the war was far from one-sided. North Korean forces are driven deep into the peninsula, exploiting speed, coordination, and the initial collapse of southern defences. Terrain, too, worked in their favour. Korea's mountains and narrow corridors slowed the advance of UN heavier forces, turning movement into attrition. But what emerged was not a simple story of overwhelming strength on one side and weakness on the other, but a brutal struggle in which early advantage, geography, and determination mattered just as much as numbers on paper. Still, the stage was now set for a dramatic shift. Because the war that had begun with sudden invasion was about to meet its first major turning point, one that would see the tide begin, slowly and violently, to turn. That turning point came in the September of 1950. By this stage, UN and South Korean forces were still holding the fragile line around the Busan perimeter, but pressure was beginning to ease. Reinforcements had arrived, air superiority was being established, and crucially, a bold plan had been formed to break the stalemate entirely. It was a plan that many considered reckless. Douglas MacArthur, the UN commander in the region, instead of continuing his slow grinding push north from Busan, he proposed something far more ambitious: a massive amphibious landing far behind enemy lines in the port city of Incheon, near Seoul. Incheon was heavily fortified in theory, surrounded by tidal mudflats and narrow channels that made invasion extremely difficult. Many of MacArthur's own staff warned it was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too likely to fail. But if it succeeded, it would change everything. On the 15th of September 1950, it was launched. UN naval forces surged toward the west coast of Korea under cover of dawn. Marines and infantry landed across the shifting tides, scaling sea walls and pushing inland against scattered resistance. The element of surprise was absolute. North Korean forces had not expected an attack there, let alone on that scale. Within days, Incheon was secured. From there, the UN advance moved rapidly. Seoul, which had fallen so early in the war, was now cut off and retaken in fierce urban fighting. North Korean supply lines were severed. Units that had pushed deep into the south suddenly found themselves at risk of encirclement. The momentum of the war shifted almost overnight. The retreat of North Korean forces was not orderly. It was fragmented, chaotic, and increasingly desperate. Entire formations were forced to abandon heavy equipment as they pulled back northward under pressure from airstrikes and advancing ground troops. What had once been a sweeping offensive had become a collapse. And for the first time since the war began, the question was no longer whether South Korea could survive, but how far UN forces would go in response. Because victory, once it entered view, has a way of changing the shape of war entirely. With Incheon secured and Seoul retaken, the momentum of the war shifted decisively. The North Korean advance, which only weeks earlier had seemed unstoppable, now collapsed into retreat. UN and South Korean forces surged forward from both directions, breaking out from the Busan perimeter in the south and pushing inland from the west coast after the landing. For the first time since the invasion, the battlefield was moving north. Rapid advances followed. Towns and cities that had fallen in the opening days of war were recaptured in quick succession. North Korean units, stretched thin and exhausted, struggled to reorganize under constant pressure from advancing infantry and overwhelming air support. Within weeks, Seoul was retaken, flags were raised in a city still scarred by occupation and urban compact, its infrastructure shattered, its population displaced, its streets bearing the imprint of months of shifting control. Yet the advance did not stop there. As confidence grew among UN commanders and political leaders, the objective began to shift. What had begun as a mission to repel invasion now involved in something far more ambitious: the possibility of reunifying Korea under a single government. UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. It was a line that once marked the uneasy division of a defeated empire. It was being erased by advancing armies. The push north was swift at first, meeting relatively light resistance in some areas as North Korean forces fell back toward the defensive positions deeper in the peninsula. Supply lines stretched, terrain grew harsher, but the sense of inevitability remained. There was optimism, even confidence that the war might soon be brought to a definitive end. In Washington, in Seoul, and within UN command structures, planning increasingly assumed that North Korea's regime could be dismantled entirely. Military success was now being discussed in political terms, and political objectives began to extend beyond containment. But the further the advance went, the more the shape of the war began to change, because Korea was not an empty space waiting to be liberated. It was a peninsula bordered by a vast power to the north, one that had been watching closely, warning repeatedly, and preparing quietly. And as UN forces moved deeper into North Korea, approaching rivers, borders, and lines that had not yet been crossed, a new question began to emerge. One that would soon redefine the entire conflict. How far was too far? And what happened when a war for containment became something far larger than anyone intended? As UN forces pushed deeper into North Korea, they began to approach a point that had been clearly defined and repeatedly warned about by one of the world's largest emerging powers. To the north lay China. Even before the crossing of the 38th parallel, signals from Beijing had been unambiguous. The new communist government, led by Mao Zedong, viewed the advance toward its border as a direct strategic threat. Public warnings were issued, diplomatic channels were used, messages were sent through multiple intermediaries. The message was simple: stop at the border or face consequences. But on the ground, momentum was already in motion. UN commanders, buoyed by rapid success and apparent collapse of North Korean resistance, continued to push northward. The assumption in many quarters was that China, still recovering from its own civil war, not intervened directly, at least not on a scale that could alter the outcome of the conflict. In the late October 1950, Chinese forces began crossing into Korea. At first, it was not fully recognized as formal intervention. Units moved quietly at night through mountainous terrain. They were referred to as the People's Volunteer Army, a designation that marked the scale of what was unfolding. But the reality soon became impossible to ignore. Wave after wave of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu River, moving into a position of discipline, speed, and overwhelming numbers. Unlike earlier phases of the war, this was not a fragmented resistance. It was a coordinated mass mobilization, and when they struck hard. UN forces extended far into the north and operating under the assumption of diminishing resistance, suddenly confronted by a force they had not fully anticipated. Supply lines were disrupted. Forward positions were isolated. Entire units found themselves encircled in cold, mountainous terrain. The effect was immediate and destabilizing. What had been a confident advance halted almost overnight, and then it began to reverse. Because China's intervention was not a symbolic gesture, it was a strategic turning point of immense scale, one that fundamentally changed the balance of the war, and forced every commander, every government, and every soldier to reconsider what this conflict had become. The question was no longer how quickly Korea could be unified, but whether the UN forces could hold on at all. By early 1951, the nature of the war had changed again. China's entry had reversed momentum almost completely. UN forces, once advancing deep into the north, were now falling back in organised retreats. Seoul would change hands once more, and the front line would eventually stabilise once again near the 38th parallel, almost exactly where the war had begun. It was at this point that a new reality set in. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory without catastrophic cost. And so in the midst of ongoing fighting, negotiations began. In July 1951, representatives from the United Nations Command in North Korea, later joined by Chinese officials, opened armistice talks at Kaesong before later moving to Panmunjom. It was the beginning of one of the longest and most frustrating negotiations in modern military history. There was a paradox at the heart of it. Even as diplomats sat across tables discussing ceasefire terms, the war on the ground did not stop. Fighting continued along entrenched front lines. Hills changed hands repeatedly, often at enormous cost for gains measured in meters rather than miles. Air raids, artillery duels, and infantry assaults became part of grinding daily rhythm. The talks stalled almost immediately on one central issue: prisoners of war. The centre of this agreement was whether captured soldiers should be forcibly repatriated or allowed to choose whether to return home. What might have seemed like a procedural matter became a major political ideological deadlock, reflecting the deeper divide between the two sides. And so the war continued, not in sweeping offensives, but in exhaustion, for 2 years. By 1953, both sides were worn down. Casualties had mounted into the millions. Cities lay devastated, and the front line remained largely unchanged. Political will slowly shifted towards the ending conflict, not with victory, but with halt. On the 27th of July 1953, an armistice agreement was finally signed. But it's important to understand what that meant and what it did not. It was not a peace treaty. No formal end to the war that was ever declared. Instead, the agreement simply established a ceasefire and created the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a heavily fortified buffer separating North and South Korea along the final front line. Technically, legally, and diplomatically, the Korean War was never formally ended. It is, in a strict sense, still ongoing. What exists today is not peace in the traditional meaning of the word, but an armistice, a pause in the fighting that lasted more than 70 years. A frozen conflict held in place by history, politics, and the absence of final settlement. And so, the war that began in 1950 did not conclude with victory or defeat. It ended where it started, divided, unresolved, and still shaping the world today. Even though the guns fell silent in 1953, the Korean War never truly disappeared. It left behind a peninsula divided not just by a line on a map, but by two entirely different paths of history. In the south, the Republic of Korea rebuilt itself from the ruins of war. What followed was decades of rapid transformation. From a country devastated by invasion to one of the world's major industrial and technological powers, cities like Seoul rose again not once but twice. First from war and then into global modernity. Yet beneath that progress, the memory of conflict remains present in everyday life, in national service, in education, and in constant awareness that peace is not guaranteed, but maintained. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea developed along a very different trajectory, shaped by isolation and military focus, became one of the most closed societies in the world. The legacy of the war is still essential to its identity, politics, and worldview. The conflict is not remembered as a chapter of history, but as an unfinished struggle, one that defines its relationship with both the South and the wider world. And between them lies the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth, a strip of land that, paradoxically, has become become both a symbol of division and a fragile barrier to a renewed war. Nature has reclaimed parts of it over the decades, turning into an unexpected refuge for wildlife. But beneath that silence remains one of the most militarized frontiers in existence. For the people of both Koreas, the war is not distant history. It's family history. It's missing relatives, separated homes, and generations who have grown up on either side of a border that few can cross. Occasional reunions, diplomatic summits, and moments of thaw have often glimpses of possibility, but never a final resolution. And beyond the peninsula itself, the Korean War reshaped global politics in a way that still echoes today. It's solidified Cold War alliances, redefined military strategy, and established the United Nations as a body capable of collective military action, even if only briefly and imperfectly. But perhaps its most enduring legacy is its status as a war without closure, conflict frozen in time, and still even now quietly shaping the way two nations see themselves and each other every single day. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War, but for those who lived through it and those who still live with its consequences, it was never forgotten at all. It's a reminder that wars do not always end in victory or defeat. Sometimes they simply stop. Sometimes they leave borders where there once were none, and silence where there was once devastation. And sometimes they leave questions that history has never fully answered. Thank you for listening. This has been History is a Story. Good night.